This is Unsiloed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Matt Feeney, who is a political philosopher, a writer, and also the author of this book right here, Little Platoons, a defense of family in a competitive age. Now, Matt, look, you're a political philosopher, and in political philosophy, we're always kind of focusing on things like human nature and the organization of society and how kind of society and individuals, the relationship between societies and individuals and how societies shape individuals and how individuals kind of come together to create social units or little polises. I forget, what is it in Greek? Poles? I can't remember the.
I believe that, the plural suffix is. I'm not a Greek reader or speaker, but I think the plural suffix is oi.
Yeah,
so I think it's poloi.
I got to dust off those that part of the memory. But in this book, you describe kind of not only kind of, I mean, there's the virtue of family and the role of family in the broader society, but also I think you diagnose gently diagnose some of the kind of pathologies that we're seeing in the world today, where the families have become enlisted in this kind of broader societal effort to create kind of diligent and competitive and obedient individuals. Right? I don't know if that's a fair description. There's much more to the book, but I think that coming into this as a political philosopher, as opposed to being a sociologist or a psychologist, you offer a really unique perspective on kind of what's happening to family life in the 21st century, particularly among the bourgeois families that you how you describe the families. I think that we see pushing strollers and competing to get into college around us. So it's a very personal story, and I think your interest was drawn to this primarily by your experience raising 3 children. Is that right? Or do you kind of go back? Is your interest kind of flow back to your graduate school research?
Well, it's more like a handful of things kind of came together. When I was asked by a editor friend who works at the New Yorker to write a piece about, this is in 2016, early 2016, I was asked to write a piece about some high school, a kind of controversy that was building around a high school in suburban Philadelphia, where a principal was trying to bring down the level of competitive intensity at the school, because it was fairly typical stuff. It was a time when you were hearing about suicide clusters in places like Silicon Valley, and from teenage kids, especially teenage kids in intensive kind of super competitive high school environments. And so this principal wanted to tone down the intensity at his school. And just the atmosphere and culture of competition. And so I read about this online, and people were making fun of it. And my first thing was to make fun of it too, right? Because I feel like, well, I'm all for academic rigor and that kind of thing. But as I kind of thought about it, I thought, well, this is this guy's onto something, that this, and then that's where it brought me to my kind of role as a father. My kids were all either just about to enter grade school or were in grade school at the time. And I just thought, oh, man, this is such a drag. I don't want, the kinds of things that these families, that this principal was having to deal with, the kinds of things that they were throwing themselves into, and the kind of the way that they viewed their role and their function as families was just such a bummer to me. I just thought, I don't want to submit my family to a competitive system. I want my children to learn, and I want them to become serious students, but I don't want that to be done for this kind of contingent reason of kind of entering and succeeding, optimizing themselves for this competition. And I just thought that it was it was just kind of soul sucking. I thought that the idea of family life is this. I was very attracted to the idea of my family life, and I lived my life as a parent, kind of conducting my family life as in a way, as sort of refuge from that kind of reductive, dehumanizing forces kind of outside our home. And then I think, well, did I really have to, well, in fact, I have to, if I want my kids to compete, everybody has to compete now. You gotta kind of, if everyone's competing, if you don't compete, then you're screwed. Your kids are going to be on the bottom of the barrel. And so just, I had been trying not to think about this stuff. And then when I was kind of joking about it on Twitter, and an editor kind of, my editor asked me if I wanted to write a piece on it. And then that kind of required me to think systematically about it. And it just required me to kind of confront what a bummer it is that this is what's, for a lot of people, this is, these kinds of forces kind of enter into their calculations as parents, and kind of really reform people's conception of what their role is, what the role of family is, and what the role of parents is. And so in doing that, it kind of brought me to, as we were speaking of before we started recording, I had this idea of the family, informed in a certain way by my kind of study of Kant and Kant's kind of theory of culture. This idea of a kind of aesthetic culture as a kind of redoubt, a refuge from the kind of reductive forces of economic life, and a place where the kind of rules of temporality and the rules of meaning are different than they are out in the other world. And I thought that, so I viewed kind of family life as a kind of an analogy to this idea of kind of aesthetic culture in Kant. That was the kind of the origin, you could say the kind of normative kind of origins of my kind of understanding of this. And I thought that, on one hand, it sounds a little bit kind of high flown and philosophical, but on the other hand, I feel like it's a fairly intuitive conception of family life in a different way. This is the idea of the family as, kind of the title of Christopher Lash's book, A Haven in a Heartless World. The idea of family as this kind of encircled kind of other domain that has its own rules, and that is a kind of zone of a kind of freedom from these outside forces. And so that was the kind of original way in which I kind of confronting this issue made me kind of formulate my sense of what family was for, and what its virtues were. But then, interestingly, it kind of turned. There's a certain sense in which, in the middle of kind of writing this piece, my conception of this relationship turned from being simply like the family as a kind of, in this kind of negative freedom mode, or the family as kind of a space of protection against these outside forces. And I realized that, well, in this particular regime that we're living in now, family gets kind of refigured to become this kind of productive force, where families are, that in order to compete with each other, the families kind of like undertake all these kind of optimizing strategies. And on the other side of these efforts are these institutions which kind of absorb and grow from the efforts that these families are putting out. In the article that I wrote, the thing that I ended up focusing on, and it really is the kind of the ultimate focus of my book, was the college admissions process and the college admissions bureaucracy, and the way in which the efforts of families and at this point, high schoolers and ambitious teenagers, the way in which their competitive attitude toward each other spurs to a kind of willingness to work on their application cells, and the way in which this competition seeds just tremendous amounts of moral and cultural and psychological power to these institutions, to the personnel of these selective admissions bureaucracies. And it's a really fun. People don't really stop to think about just how much power, really direct, intimate power, the personnel of college admissions, especially selective college admissions bureaucracies, have over the kind of inner self-conceptions of teenagers. And I thought, well, this is a real powerful and disturbing example of the relationship between family, the political relationship between families and institutions such as the admissions bureaucracy, which in this competitive regime end up taking on almost a kind of quasi-sovereign leverage over their subjects. That is to say, there's no exit, really. There's no option for exit. You pretty much have to play the game according to the rules that they set. And they have this very benign view of themselves, and so they observe very few checks on the kinds of influence that they see themselves as justified in exerting. And so anyways, I ended up kind of working backward from there and just kind of like seeing the way in which that particular process of kind of institutional integration of families kind of plays out at earlier and earlier stages of parenthood and childhood.
So, I mean, I think the kind of liberal political economy that we all kind of believe in or subscribe to in the United States and, other parts of the West is that, we've got individuals, kind of a Lockean view, we get these individuals and they get together and form families, and then, the families kind of get together and create these, civic society, and then, the government's up there kind of doing our bidding. Which contrasts with the view that everybody's essentially, a soldier in the army of the government, right? And if you think about Nazi Germany, right, where it's like, hey, the family is there to manufacture, right, soldiers for the army, right? It's just an extension of the state, and so kind of we tend to believe that this liberal idea is kind of the world we live in, but we're kind of we're kind of blind to the ways in which we're obeying things that are more or less beyond our control. And a lot of people point to the market and how the market has this impact on us. And you have a chapter where you talk about how all of us are becoming kind of slaves. I love the I forget what the phrase was that you used. And we're automatons with engineered machine engagement, right? You're talking about kind of how kids become kind of slaves to their devices, but it's also kind of this marketplace for college admissions, right? And it is a market, and no one forces anybody to go to college, but I think if you want to succeed and you want to achieve any kind of status, then you kind of have to go to college in today's world, and you feel like you have to go to the best college that you can get into. So, I mean, is this argument sort of a part of a broader argument about how maybe the autonomy that we think we have as individuals and family is something of an illusion, and that we're really kind of marching to pressures in the way that Foucault describes in our society?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I would say that I tend to shy away from that. There's a way of kind of taking this argument about the kind of unfreedom that coincides with the kind of market liberality, and I at least in the book I tend to shy away from a kind of more the kind of broader kind of structural kind of explanation, kind of say Marxist, I say theory of ideology or something like that, or kind of explaining the ways in which we're not as free as kind of liberal economic theory would say we are, and focus instead on the particular institutions that that in historical time kind of have evolved to not just the institutions like the college admissions process and other things, but also the behaviors themselves that have evolved in the relation in relation to specific changes in the economy. So that the process that I guess that latently there is this possibility that in a world of economic freedom we can kind of work ourselves into condition of unfreedom in various ways. But in the story that I tell is that there's a particular kind of historical development, which is to say the kind of the development of the knowledge economy, the kind of retreat of unionized blue collar jobs, things like that, where the salience of a college degree increased dramatically, and at the same time, at the same, so as you know, and it's hard to say. I'm not an economist, and so you might quibble with my claims about the economic changes, but one of the things that seems to have happened is this became a kind of mantra in our society, is that parents kind of absorb this message, and the parents with the most kind of the most far-seeing parents, the parents with the greatest sense of agency, kind of took it upon themselves to kind of change how they started raising their kids. And I'm speaking about a time, you know, a lot of the data seems to suggest that this happened from different directions. The data converged to say that this started to happen really in the early 1990s, where the first of all, the messaging about the economy was much more about going to college. The public policy, you know, the Clinton administration very much was oriented toward kind of maximizing the number of kids who went to college. You know, and part of this was a response, or it was largely a response to the change in the economy, where it said, well, pretty much you got to go to college now because you can't have a middle class life if you're trying to work from a high school diploma. And so these are the material and public policy inputs of this process, which then kind of get channeled through the minds and stratagems of anxious parents, and which becomes a kind of as I describe it, it kind of becomes a feedback loop, right? So you end up creating the unfreedom that I kind of talk about consists in this kind of Hobbesian feedback loop of anxiety and fear and competitive adaptation that families undertake. So that's one aspect of it. That's one kind of like dimension of the unfreedom, in that we kind of find ourselves in this a problem, this collective action problem, where everyone is, you know, kind of, we're just all responding to cues from each other, which essentially amplify the signals that we're getting from politicians and from the economy. Amplify it within the circuits of the feedback loop, within the social system of parents, in a way that makes it perhaps, you know, at once a kind of an exaggerated depiction of reality, but on the other hand, a depiction of reality that we have to observe as real because other parents are doing it. So if everybody is kind of absorbing this fear message and adapting in a way to kind of competitively hone their kids according to it, then even if the fear message is in a sense, or in an original sense, an exaggeration, it ends up becoming the reality that we have to calculate by. And so in that way, that is a kind of dimension of unfreedom, this kind of Hobbesian unfreedom, the freedom of a kind of, you know, state of fear, of state of war, of state of nature. But then the other side of it is the way that institutions evolve to kind of dictate terms of entry throughout the various stages of this competition. And so, again, if there's no exit, if you feel like you have to participate in this system, then these institutions take on a kind of quasi-sovereign status in your life. You can't, without at least the perception that you're paying a rather substantial cost to exit from this competition, you have to basically do what these institutions tell you to do. And so that is another kind of a glitch in the system of liberal freedom, where at a certain point of kind of, you know, at a certain point in which a kind of competitive mindset becomes a system in which everyone operates, then the nature of your agency within that system changes, and the optimistic Lockean view of people kind of operating at this sub-governmental level, free of coercion, does not entirely fit.
Well, so part of it is this collective action problem, where, you know, the outcome really does matter, right? So, you know, the status is real, and the capacity to, you know, achieve this status is a function of the quality of the school you get into and the quality of the, you know, education you get further down, you know, up the supply chain. But then there's another piece which is more empirical. Like, is this actually real? Now, the latter, if it is real, then there's nothing you can do as an individual parent to kind of opt out of this, because if you opt out of this, then, you know, potentially your child is going to fail. But if it's not as real as we think it is, then there is some way that we can kind of opt out of at least you know, the exaggerated fear element. So So maybe we can start with the empirical question, which is, does it really matter, right? So does it matter in terms of the long-term success and happiness of your child? Does it matter, what school they get into, right? What college they get into, what high school they get into, what nursing, what daycare they get into, right? At the end of the day, does it matter? Does each step along the way? You mentioned in the book about even parents to be starting to fret over what daycare their kid gets into, because they think that that's going to impact what private school they get into and how well they do, and then what college they get into, and ultimately, presumably, the parents are not just. That's not where the concern ends, right? They're really interested in the happiness and prosperity of their kids and grandkids. So does it matter as much as people think it does? I mean, I think it's an empirical question, right?
Right, and I think it's hard to the most natural place, and the place that I kind of discuss in my conclusion, somewhat ambivalently or like non-committally, to kind of examine this question is on the matter of admission to college and the way in which admission to a given college over a different college affects one's earnings. I think that's the way in which it's been. I've not seen evidence. I've not seen studies that that attempt to measure the life success or happiness or virtue of the other of people, depending on how they conduct this stuff. But so instead, it's about whether or not how much money your kid makes when he graduates from Harvard rather than from the University of Michigan or whatever. And in that, there's a couple of Alan Kruger, the late economist, generated a couple of studies that were fairly skeptical of the idea that college was. That where you go to college is really important, and I take a great deal of heart from these studies because it kind of accords with my idea of how we should go about these things, which is to say that who your kid is. It seems the lesson from these studies seems to be who your kid is matters more than what college they go to. Yes, kids from high ranked colleges make more money than kids from lower ranked colleges, but if you actually look at the incomes of kids who could have gone either place. It's a wash, and I
suggest really it's more of a selection effect than a treatment effect, right?
Right, it's a selection effect. Now there are other studies there's another study that compared kids who were right at the cutoff line for acceptance into I don't know if it was flagship universities nationwide or flagship universities. It was in Texas, but that showed that there was, in fact, that kids who, basically this arbitrary 1 point cutoff line for the say an SAT score to get into a flagship university, the kids who went to flagship universities did, in fact, make more money than the kids who went to, the less highly ranked state universities with more or less identical qualifications. So there's a complication to the story that I think in the empirical literature, there's a complication of the story that Kruger et al. Tell, and so I don't have a definitive answer to the question. I mean, basically, it becomes a kind of pragmatic question about how important this stuff is to you, and so I end up saying something like, well, if it's really that important to you, then you should act as if Kruger's right? Act as if Kruger's the one who's telling the true tale about the, how much this competitive stuff, at this stage of your kid's life, how much that matters. And so it's so ultimately I don't really come down on one side of the issue or another. But in one of the other things I suppose I point to is the idea that, maybe there's a way of, even within the parameters that kind of this competition kind of sets for us, to kind of, try to elbow out as much freedom from the more dehumanizing and paralyzing types of competitive constraint that we find ourselves under, I speak as because I didn't go to a great school. I went to Central Michigan University. I was a screw up in high school. I was a jock and a screw up in high school, and I kind of remember those years fondly. But at the same time, I can't say that I would have done better in life if I had actually taken my education seriously, starting at some point before when I entered a Ph.D. program. But so so I have a kind of an odd perspective on this, because I really do have a kind of fond idea of family as a site of the kind of purposeless, useless pleasures of just goofing off and retreating from this stuff. And so when I engage with the empirical literature, I have a strong bias to believe the parts of it that tell the story I want, which is to say the story where it says, your kid is your kid, and there's, you have a job as a parent to cultivate your child's virtues and abilities, but that there's a point at which optimizing that kid is an injury to that kid's spiritual integrity and autonomy, and so that's the kind of normative kind of sentimental disposition I bring to the whole thing, is to kind of wish for or to seek a kind of as much latitude within the constraints that this system imposes on us as possible.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that income is the dependent variable, right, that people obsess on, right? Why? I mean, is that just because it's easy to measure? I mean, look, I'm much more aware of the business school rankings, and in the business school rankings, income is, first and foremost, like that's the number one thing that they use in evaluating all of these different business schools. And it seems puzzling that is now also the way in which we evaluate kind of undergraduate institutions. I mean, it's sort of an unstated premise that that's the only thing that matters. Now, maybe it's just the only thing that we can measure. So I don't think that we could, evaluate the graduates of these different schools on things like virtue, right? I mean, I've had conversations, for instance, with the admissions people at my university, my business school, and trying to figure out, like, okay, what should we be optimizing for on admissions? And, do we want, like, people who make the biggest impact on the world, or do we want people who make the most money in the world? Do we want people who donate the most money to the school? Like, what is it that we're trying to optimize for? And, even though we talk a lot about values and virtues and so forth, at the end of the day, those things kind of disappear and drop out because they're not, you can't measure them.
Right, and this is one of the dilemmas of the entire thing, especially the admissions part of it. I am putting a sweater on because my wife left the door in our bedroom open for a long time and it's freezing in here. When you do try to select or optimize for these other things, I talk about the old Harvard admissions guy, that when you do try to optimize for these more kind of these other virtues, in a regime in which the selection procedure is known, these selection criteria are known outside, they're known among your pool of applicants. Your selection criterion becomes a kind of treatment influence, right? That kids come to knowing the virtues that the school is looking for. They try to inhabit those virtues and become the people that the admissions department is looking for. And so that's so it's a real dilemma. So you can't. It's really hard to humanize this process at this level of competition without turning it into just another kind of competition. And that's what you see in the, that's my hugest, my overriding complaint about the admissions process is the way in which it. So there is a problem with kind of like the reductive character of this, but.
Drew, I think the problem is with competition in general. I mean, if we look in India, for instance, everything boils down to a standardized test, and that's it. And so kids will basically spend their entire childhood just trying to figure out how to do well on these standardized tests. And I think a lot of us in the United States would folks that I know would look at that and say, oh, that's terrible, right? The kids' lives are ruined because they're spending all this time memorizing all this stuff, and they're not having rich and flourishing childhoods. So we're going to select for other things, and like, do you run your own NGO or that kind of thing, and it's not clear that makes the childhoods any better, right? Because then people are competing along those other dimensions. And is it just the nature? Is it just the fact that it is going to be competitive? The fact that there's a scarce thing that people are going to be fighting over that inherently is going to flow back in and redirect our efforts towards things that are competitive as opposed to kind of good in and of themselves, right? Against some objective, non-competitive metric.
There does seem to be a kind of trade-off between a kind of resigned sociology of this stuff. You think of like European countries where educational tracking happens much earlier. And so for the kids who are going into the university track, they're, the last stages of their academic life are not filled with this. They've been kind of told they're going to university. And so the salience of which university you go to in places like Germany, especially France, it's different, but it's not that great, that there people aren't just kind of, and same as in Canada, that there's different ways in which the selection process for the university takes on a lot less significance than it does here. And I guess that's kind of my focus. That becomes kind of my focus as kind of from a reform standpoint, or the way the kind of counterfactuals that I invoke are the ones. Canada is the one that I refer to a lot, partly because it's culturally, in a lot of ways, economically, it's our closest kin among nations. And the Canadian system is again, and this is to say that the problem as I identify it is partly a problem of institutional design. So yes, it's going to be competitive in a lot of different ways everywhere, especially in this economy and stuff. But America seems to have the institutional design of American education seems to create a particularly far-reaching and articulated sort of set of kind of disciplinary prompts for families and kids to agree to and to conform with. So like you have a system in which it's all about a test, right? And so that's one kind of deformity that's inflicted upon a childhood by a particular competitive system. Whereas in the U.S., it is about not just, there's still the test, although decreasingly so for reasons that are not as healthy, I think, as a lot of us like to think. But there's all these other things that, in what's disturbing about these other things is the way in which they end up supplanting the role of parents, the ethical role of parents in the formation of their kids, with this bureaucratic process in which these selection personnel send out into the world of families a set of criteria, a set of essentially character traits that they like, and then you see kids kind of performing to embody and inhabit these character, to make themselves into the kinds of people that the admissions departments like. And I just feel like that is, from a political standpoint, that's simply that's an exercise of coercive power, intimate coercive power that is really disturbing to me. I think that is a way in which so that you have this articulation of these procedures in a way that kind of reaches down into the soul, into the cells and souls of teenagers. That is that's a kind of disturbing illiberal. I mean, to me, it's fundamentally illiberal. A liberal relationship that is established between young people and institutions. I grew up during the Cold War, and for me, like the textbook kind of illiberality of communism was something like Soviet psychiatry. The idea that somehow that you could that the sovereign had access to the inner contents of your psyche and could deem you, could dictate particular kinds of personality traits that it preferred, and penalized the ones that it didn't prefer, and establish procedures of psychiatry to create the one and to minimize the other. And so the idea that that power was working intentionally working inside the psyches of citizens was something that seemed to me to be just a kind of textbook kind of modern tyranny. And I don't want to be over dramatic and say that the admissions departments are doing Soviet psychiatry, but like the moral reach of their procedures it seems similar to me. And it just seems like the inner lives of kids, should be off limits to bureaucrats as far as I'm concerned. And so that is, so that's the way, so that is the kind of the bargain that we've made, right? And to kind of like to have the kinds of institutions that set up these selection procedures. We don't have a single test, but we do have like 8,000 private schools which compete with each other, and with via, among other things, the virtue seeking of their admissions procedures, and it's and it has some really dark consequences. As I
think
see
you have an analogy, which is like social media, right? So for kids, when they are creating a social media profile, maybe on Instagram or whatever, right? People talk about it as self-expression or empowerment, but you point out that the power really lies in the audience, right? Because ultimately what they're going to be trying to do is satisfy their audience and seek out positive feedback and positive reinforcement. And so ultimately, by putting themselves out there, they're essentially, I don't want to say enslaving themselves to the preferences of their customers, right? And parents are essentially in the business of producing a product that is in demand by these universities. Now, I mean, maybe would this be less of a problem if there was more heterogeneity among what these different schools were looking for? I mean, if that were the case, then you could kind of choose which market segment you want to target with your product, right? your the things that you're producing out of your factory, right? So that if kind of like if you're somebody who likes to make artisanal bread that's ethically sourced, right? There's going to be demand for that here in Berkeley. Maybe not so much in Iowa, right? But you could kind of decide kind of what you want your kids to look like, and be sure that there would be some place where they would be able to find a home at a university. But so is the problem really that there's this almost lockstep conformity among admission directors, all of whom are chasing after the same uniform hierarchical ranking that is imposed on them by U.S. News or whoever?
Right. I mean, I think that's there is this is the other complication of the kind of liberal economic story with regard to U.S. institutions, is that, so on one hand you think, well, we got all these colleges, right? There should be this kind of competition where you would be able to kind of find your niche. There is, and I don't want to say that there's not the possibility of that, because there's a fair, at the margins, there's a fair amount of variety, but it's largely colleges that operate outside the main kind of prestige hierarchy, and you have to say that you're kind of rolling the dice in that, right? So you say, well, you do want to have you want to send your kid to artisanal bread school or whatever, but that is how what if the artisanal bread market tanks, and what's your kid trained for? So if you're going to have this kind of super specialized, you're going to go through the college process but make it a super specialized thing, then you really better hope that there's going to be a life for people who study those things when they graduate. I went to the school I went to had a big broadcasting and media arts department, broadcasting and TV. And the number of kids, it was very attractive. You're 19 years old, 18 years old, and you're like, well, I want to major in broadcasting. I want to be, this is in Michigan, right? And like, this is not like suburban elite people, but like, I want to be a DJ or something. Really, people thought they entered college thinking they were going to study to be a radio DJ. And so few kids got those jobs, like they ended up virtually no one. I know one guy who got a super marginal, like AM radio news job. But for the most part, it was just a fool's errand to try to do that stuff. And so that's a kind of concern that, like, so when you're on the outside in an economy like the U.S., when you're outside the main competitive system, you kind of like seek these niche opportunities, and it's kind of cool, and it's great if you can kind of link up. But for the most part, I think that a lot of parents would think, well, that's kind of a risky proposition to try to do that. So they go the main route. But the problem with that, and America has 3,000 four-year colleges, and and some hundreds of selective colleges and universities. But there is, I talk about this, and I imagine you're familiar with this research too on institutional isomorphism. This idea that institutions, because they're kind of competing with each other, they're all competing kind of within the same kind of currency of status, and there's a strong tendency among these institutions to end up resembling each other. So you can't simultaneously signal viability within the competitive system and some serious institutional idiosyncrasy. If you act like you're too unique, then you don't, then you're going to be kind of weird within the competitive framework, within the status framework of the institutions, which act a lot like the status framework of the applicants themselves, the students. And so there's a strong tendency toward homogeneity. There's just a powerful institutional tendency toward homogeneity, just in general, but especially in a market like the U.S. college market that is so stitched together via these rankings, and so that it ends up being like a single thing. That's kind of how I conceive it. That the college apparatus confronts the high schooler as like one selection apparatus. And so, according to the kind of school choice model or the neoliberal economics model, this abundance of institutions should yield an abundance of choice. But in fact, that choice is kind of an illusion. And in the illusory nature of that choice, the fact that, the students are all competing against each other, the colleges are all competing against each other, ends up imparting, colleges are in a way in a perpetually desperate position, right? They're always trying to kind of preserve their status, but they are. But it also gives them, a fairly powerful leverage over students, and so the kind of neoliberal economic model applied to the abundance of American institutions that are supposed to be competing with each other does not really pay off in terms of the autonomy of the consumer and a real variety of choice.
So maybe we can talk a bit about how this kind of flows backwards, because, I certainly started thinking about colleges when I was, 13, 14, whatever. But I think most of my colleagues didn't start thinking about it until they were, 17 or whatever. But I think you make the point that it's almost before you even, start thinking about having children, you start thinking about this, and it flows back to things like competitive sports and competitive resume building and competitive daycare and so forth, and you point out, and I think lots of people have been pointing this out, that the amount of parenting that goes on is higher than it's pretty much ever been in human history, and the amount of time we spend with our kids and helping them with their homework or whatever has kind of gone through the roof. I grew up in the 70s, so my parents were pretty much completely, hands off, right? I mean, see them at dinner, and that was about it. And they would drop me off at soccer practice, and if I was lucky, they might pick me up. But I don't think they watched too many games, and certainly didn't watch practice, right? So right. What does this do to what's the net impact on kids, and what's the impact on parents of this hyper competitiveness?
Well, I kind of suppose in my book I leave a lot of this stuff unstated but implied, right? So there's this like stories of kind of like fragile kids who kind of struggle to kind of achieve independence, anxious parents, parents who can't let go. It is.
I think you had this one story. You had this one story
the way
where
that it seems to me.
this one story where the parents were showing up for lunch in schools. This was kind of I had never heard this. I was shocked, but one time there was a parent that showed up for the Ph.D. Admissions interview and sat through the Ph.D. admissions interview here at Berkeley. I was kind of shocked. I was amazed. I'd never heard of such a thing. But showing up for school lunches, that's another first. I hadn't heard of that. That's kind of over the top.
Yeah. Right. So, that kind of goes, there's a story I tell about the larger story in that chapter is about how parents kind of like become convinced. This is another way in which the signal, you just start with just a minimal signal of kind of parenting efficacy, something that comes in and you think, well, that's what I got to do. So the signal comes in that parental involvement. You learn that parental involvement is super important for academic success. This is the story. This is kind of like, you just learn that, right? That phrase, parental involvement. You're like, all right, well, parental involvement, I got to like do stuff. And so that means parental involvement at school, and you go to school and so like the kind of perhaps the absurd extreme version of this is parents who actually show up and have lunch with their kids, sitting at the lunch table with their kids. Again, this is a suburban phenomenon. I think it was first identified in Connecticut, unsurprisingly, and where parents, and it may be a function of the fact that parents are so busy that they don't see their kids when they get home because they're working or whatever. But I think that in general, it is just this sense of wanting to kind of optimize your kind of hands-on time or maximize the amount of hands-on time you have with your kids. And combined with this ideology of parental involvement, which, as I treat it in my chapter, and is a lot more complicated story than we think. But again, it's just like, so the effect on parents really is this sense that there's always something that you should be doing, right? There's always if my kid is just sitting there, he's not doing math flashcards. Why is my kid doing math flashcards, or something? So there's a sense that like more is, the kind of an ethos of more is more, that you can always be doing something to optimize your kids' competitive viability. Especially academically, but of course it goes into other areas as well. But yeah, so it is, so I would say that it's just in general the effect on this is speculative because there's not really, I don't really, but there's a fair amount of anecdotal evidence suggests that we, as parenting has intensified, the children of this intensified parenting are becoming more fragile and have a harder time kind of achieving independence so it does not really seem to be doesn't seem to be the healthiest way to raise your kids, basically.
But it's not just that the parents feel compelled to do this against their preferences. I mean, you highlight how this is intensely gratifying to you, right? Spending time with your kids is enjoyable. I mean, it in many ways. And so, could it be that even if it's bad for your kids, you're gonna want to do it? And it's kind of, you have to force yourself to not spend time with your kids if you're kind of interested in promoting certain characteristics of them.
Yeah, and just in general, again, there's a way in which you think that like once the intensive parenting switch gets kind of flicked on, and now you're like, instead of like your kids being this half noticed kind of like underfoot characteristic of your household, as I was and my 5 siblings were for my parents, that instead you're like looking your kids in the eye, 7, 8 times a day and saying, what do you want? What are we doing now? When you kind of like turn to this mode, it's kind of wonderful. You live this life of engagement with these beautiful little people, and but the suspicion is that you're doing this for yourself, that it's really wonderful for you, and your kids seem to enjoy it, right? But that you kind of step back and you ask yourself, whether or not this is, whether or not, prior generations were doing it wrong or perhaps doing it right for for spending, paying less attention to their kids, and letting their kids figure stuff out on their own, letting their kids kind of forge their own little micro paths throughout childhood, instead of always having a parent present, kind of asking what they want, asking what they want to do, affirming them, kind of psychoanalyzing them. But so I question that. At the same time, it's really once you flick once that switch gets flicked on and you are an attentive parent, it's pretty intoxicating. I mean, it's a pretty intoxicating way to live your life, to just be constantly 6 inches away from the face of a beautiful child you love more than anything in the world, and so yeah, is that good? Is that like healthy parenting? I'm exaggerating here. I don't actually spend that much time 6 inches from my kids' faces, but is it healthy to be that kind of like up in your kid's stuff? I think that the jury, it may not be.
But I think a dark side of that is that certainly one of the things that I realized as a kid is that my parents had me in order to have me do lots of chores around the house, right? That was part of the reason why I existed. And I think now kids probably grow up thinking that part of the reason why they're created is to give their parents some meaning and some happiness, and presumably that puts also a lot of pressure on them to satisfy what their parents are looking for, and maybe a corollary to that is that a lot of this competition that you're talking about is not so much parental desire to see their kids succeed as much as it is a parental desire to achieve some status relative to other parents, right? And you talk about how, when you go out into public with your children, right, you're acutely aware of the other parents observing you and how you behave with your children, that you don't own them, that you're kind of a custodian, and the community is policing you, right? Now, obviously, we want the community to police you in case you engage in some serious child abuse, but I think certainly where you and I live here, we live in a community where that kind of judgment could be oppressive in some ways. I mean, I think certainly here in Berkeley, if in the last 2 years, if you walk around with your kid and your kid's not wearing a mask, right, you're going to get some evil eye from some neighbors and so forth, right? That you're engaging in some form of child abuse. So to what extent is this really, is the parenting that we're talking about really all about intraparental competition and competing to make sure that you have the right sticker for the back of your car when the time comes?
Right. I think that is kind of fundamental. That's a kind of fundamental issue. And the way I treat it so there's a chapter I have called Parenting in Public, in which I just, when I wrote that chapter, I wrote it as kind of a lark. I thought it was kind of a funny thing to kind of just to kind of examine the social signaling that goes on among parents. And it's not really to belittle that process, because I think it's entirely natural. We're status conscious animals, right? We are so it's just irreducible part of our kind of psychic makeup is to worry about how we look to other people, and in a way that's a very pro-social disposition. But the quirk that I kind of introduce, the historical quirk that I introduce in this chapter, is the fact that now, at a certain point, in this kind of like what we were talking about before, at a certain point, parents started basically being attending kind of public life with their children a lot more than they used to, so that kids, not just as toddlers or whatever, but as grade school. I spent my grade school years by myself with my friends out on the streets of Detroit, but my kids as grade schoolers, they were always with me, and so there was a way in which the parental parents, the natural social system of kind of status awareness among parents would kind of take on a more intense meaning and force among those parents when they're out with their kids. All of a sudden, we're not only are our kids out, but we're out with them, and not only are we out, but we're out with our kids, and people can see us how our kids are comporting themselves. how we are parenting them. And so, in seeing other parents do that, you can't but reflect on how you're seen doing it for yourself. And so there's a way in which that kind of social circuitry of parental comparison is gets intensified simply because we're just out, as a parenting culture, we're simply out in the world with our kids a lot more than parents used to be. And so you find yourself in that kind of mode of anxious kind of self-assessment about how you look to other people because you're entirely aware that you're judging them, or their behavior is visible to you in a way. They're open, at least, even if you decline to judge them, and they're exposed to your judgment because they're out in public. And so. So there's this it's a natural thing, but it takes on these different I was just in Michigan over a break and over Christmas, and the judgments. So here in Oakland and Berkeley, you might get the stink eye for not having a mask on your kids or not wearing a mask yourself. I frankly almost never wear a mask when I go outside. But in Michigan, in my small town, the opposite might be the case. If you're done up as a masky Anthony Fauci type, you might have some dude walking down the street or down the aisle in a supermarket, without a mask on, in hunter's clothes, just absolutely giving you the stink eye for being a liberal wussy, and yet raising your kids to be, so it's different in different places. But I feel there's a way. I don't want to let my kind of bourgeois neighbors and myself off the hook, because I suspect that there's a way in which this process is a little more highly advanced and a little bit more conscious and fully articulated among the kind of educated precincts of the country.
Right, and I think in one of your chapters you kind of dig into youth sports, right, and the youth sports industrial complex. And what I found interesting about this is that some people might point to this and say, this is capitalism gone crazy, and there's all this money to be made, and that's not really what it's about at all, right? I mean, it really is about this status competition among parents, tied up with this belief, however tenuous, that this is somehow going to give the kids kind of a leg up. I was talking to Charles Whelan, who's a professor at Dartmouth, and he said that he was really glad that he lived in Hanover, New Hampshire, because the youth sport thing was relatively tame, and that the kids could kind of be part-time athletes and still feel like they were semi-successful. So how does youth sports really encapsulate, illustrate some of the pathologies of hyper-competitiveness among our families today?
Well, I mean, there's a strong parallel, I think, between youth sports and the college, and that the what seems like, what can seem like an abundance of choices for, like, you can put your kids in this or that, club for your sports, ends up being somewhat, the choice aspect ends up being somewhat illusory, in that, like, really, if you want your kid to play a sport, and I think of soccer is my default, because my kids have played soccer, and I late in life became a huge soccer fan. There's the clubs are the clubs. The problem with the argument that there's all this choice among the clubs is that the clubs are kind of beset by the same kind of similar forces as the colleges are, which is to say that the clubs are competing with each other. They have to kind of act like each other, and you are competing with parents. Your families are competing with each other, and so there's these kind of parallel competitions happening. And so if you want your kid to play a sport, if you want your kid to play a sport competitively, you have to the competitive side of these club sports has kind of hived off from the recreational side at fairly young ages. And you're like, well, if my kid is going to be going to treat this sport at all seriously, he has to be, or she has to be, in the competitive tier. But then once you get into the competitive, so you have to kind of jump into that realm. And then once you're in the competitive tiers, well, everybody is acting quite competitively here in this competitive tier, and I have to, my kid is gonna, if I really want her to stay in the club system, I have to, and everybody, all my peers are getting their kids extra training time and skill training and fitness training and personal training and all this stuff, then I need to do it too. Otherwise, she's going to fall behind, and she's not going to be. So simply in making this choice to enter into the competitive system, you have to kind of then submit to all the ancillary kind of competitive forces that kind of make up, that build within this system. And the result of that is, in a way, I think the sports chapter is the kind of hinge chapter in my book, because it comes closest to kind of capturing this kind of Foucault-style argument that I make about the relationship between selves and institutions, and that is that the competitive output of the families, in order to keep their kids in these competitive club systems, inspires a kind of, or it instigates a kind of set of adaptations within the clubs themselves. The clubs are very different. The club system is very different in the U.S. Than it is, say, in European countries where club sports or youth sports are run through generally academies that are owned by professional sports clubs. And so our parents have a lot less input in how things are done. In the U.S., the parents and the institutions exist much more closely together. They're partners really in the process. And so the clubs, because of the competitive imperatives that kind of that hover above parents, and also because of the competitive imperatives that the clubs feel in competing with each other, that they have the strong incentive to kind of enlist parents in basically performing the functions of the club. So the club becomes this weird hybrid thing where it's a club, but it's a club that does all this incredibly elaborate stuff that costs a lot of money, like traveling to tournaments and not just like weekend tournaments, 100 miles away, but a couple times a year you go and you fly to a different country or whatever. And the parents are the ones who are paying for this stuff, and the parents are driving their kids to soccer practice, many times a week, and they're paying for the chiropractors and their personal trainers and stuff. And so it's this weird thing where you have a club system where which requires a particular degree of athletic, competitive fitness among their athletes, but this competitive fitness is seen to not by the club but by the parents. And so it's just so anyway, it kind of creates this kind of hybrid thing, and I kind of just find it fast from a kind of a theoretical standpoint, just fascinating the way in which it illustrates a kind of Foucauldian process, as I see it, where where you talked about self-expression earlier, and the way in which technology companies make use of our self-expression. Our self-expression ends up being kind of fuel for a particular institutional system. And here it is this kind of similar way, our kind of output, our competitive output as parents, our agency, which you would think of as the kind of an expression of our freedom. Our agency is essentially fed into a system, and the system grows by virtue of the kind of the outputs that we kind of inject into it. In this case, just all of these kind of parental efforts that these competitive efforts that parents do, and so you end up with this weird hybrid system where you're the family is part family and part club, and the club is part club and part family, and so it just and there's you become, so this just becomes almost a total degree of entwinement between the functions of the two bodies. And it became very kind of, just became very kind of interesting process for me to reflect on. But also, as you said, it also kind of is, it pushes back against the argument that kind of the more familiar and I think lazy argument that people tend to make that, well, the problem with youth sports is that kind of is money, money is a problem, but it's not the problem in the way that people tend to say. They tend to put it put it in terms of, well, parents are kind of duped by some apparatus of ideology to kind of throw their money into this system. But that's not really, and so in other words, the parents' agency is kind of suppressed or kind of deformed by a kind of advertising magic that the youth sports industrial complex kind of inflicts upon them. And I just think that this is not really a very sound description of what's happening. It's much, the parents are not passive agents of ideology or passive victims of ideology. They're much more kind of active agents of a kind of competitive process that extracts and incites their competitive output and it turns it into a kind of it puts it to the use of an elaborate kind of institutional system. And so the way in which this was, might be kind of, and in doing so, I will just put it this way, in doing so, it kind of redefines family life in institutional terms. And so that's kind of one of the ways in which it is, to me, both disturbing from a kind of moral standpoint, but also kind of like fascinating from a theoretical standpoint.
Well, you said at one point you considered getting into becoming a teacher, and you were turned off by what you learned about kind of teaching, well, how teaching was taught, right? And how, there's this whole Dewey approach to teaching. It's very pragmatic, and it's about just teaching people, converting kids into kind of useful members of society. And I've talked to a lot of people who are very critical of what we might call the factory-like educational process, where people were effectively being trained to work in factories, right? Be obedient, sit still, do what you're told, tolerate boredom, that sort of thing. But and I think we've certainly come a long way. We've moved away from that model. We have a very, very different model, particularly in the more educated communities. But I think part of what you're saying is that this new model, even if it's training people for the knowledge economy instead of training them to work in factories, it's still kind of, teaching them obedience, compliance, conformity. It's just for a different type of economy.
Right. I think that's, I think this is the kind of Foucault thing, right? Where you kind of like, where there's a kind of subtraction of overt coercion, you go then look for, well, where did that power go, and what did it turn itself into? And in this case, it seems like it's turned, from it being simply a kind of prescriptive process where kids are assigned social roles and kind of like trained to conform to those social roles. Instead, the imperatives become softer, subtler, more psychological and moral. So on one hand, you have a process where the external influences of college, kind of like create a need to turn education into this functional, this instrumental thing to kind of rob education of its kind of inherent purpose. But then you also have within the schools themselves, I think this is a way in which, so the industrial model of Deweyism is maybe not as, overt as it used to be, but nonetheless, the idea that somehow or another, the teaching of students has to have a strong element of social training is, it's at least as powerful now. I mean, you just see it in schools where where there's a kind of, part of it is in the U.S., schools have to kind of, Americans are, on one hand, they kind of, we talk a good game about, valuing education, but on the other hand, we're quite impatient about, what those damn teachers are doing and all that stupid stuff and useless stuff or whatever that's being taught in the schools. And so, the schools are in this constant kind of battle to legitimize themselves to their constituents. And one of the ways in which they do that is to claim a kind of social relevance for what's happening within the classroom, and in this imperative to kind of like prove yourself and to show your value is, in a certain way very much kind of like within the Deweyan kind of tradition of educational thinking, even if the details have changed some. And so it is really hard in American context, I think, to kind of take something like education and allow it, to kind of grant it a kind of autonomy, from the pressing functions of everyday life, and to kind of allow it to kind of have its own internal logic. Everything has to be made to show, to pay off, in the long run. either in economic or in economic terms, or in terms of social harmony, or social adjustment of your children. And so it's an ongoing problem in this country. I think that we are it's kind of part in a way in which my book is a kind of a story about the way that things, American things that once were virtues, or that are has a kind of virtuous element to them, get at a certain level of kind of institutional saturation, get turned into something that's a little bit nefarious. And so in the U.S., our practical streak, which is in certain ways quite virtuous, gets turned on institutions that I think ideally would enjoy a certain distance from the practical exigencies of economy and social adjustment and things like that. And schools are one. I would say, like, things like the art world and things like that are another area in which it's very hard in America to simply have things be for themselves rather than for some larger social function.
Well, I like to think that within every good book that describes the world, there's contained within it some advice on how to live your life, and I think there is buried in your book some advice for parents. And the book is called "The Defense of Family in a Competitive Age," and I want to, what do you mean by that, a defense of family? Because right, I know some folks that have decided to kind of just check out of the whole competitive regime and homeschool their kids and move out to a farm and so forth, and it seems to me that kind of isolation, or that kind of family atomism is not a solution. I mean, it seems very unnatural, right? The whole idea of a nuclear family as the primary entity without a broader community, without sharing the raising of children with others, seems like a very, very modern and awkward and unnatural invention. So how do you strike this balance? I mean, how do you as a parent in today's world, how do you opt out of the competitive pathologies without leading to without basically destroying your children's capacity to succeed in this world?
Yeah, it's a dilemma, and I kind of I swear off offering authoritative advice in my conclusion. But at the same time, the people that you talk about is opting out. I have to say, I find that option, there's a way in which I find it kind of personally attractive, and I could not, because I have a kind of, I find it it'd be nice to do that kind of stuff. I have the institutions that I feel like obliged to submit my family to, I'm not particularly fond of, but I can't do that partly because I'm married to somebody who's a lot less of a kind of who's much more peaceable regarding her social surroundings than I am, and so and she's she doesn't want to homeschool her kids, anything like that. Not because she's lazy, because she's extremely energetic, but because she just doesn't like the posture of opposition that is expressed in that, and doesn't want to live in that mode of antagonism with her outside world. Now, it's the case though that this idea of the nuclear family, at least in its kind of ideological origins, and also its sociological origins in the Industrial Revolution, the idea that the family was a kind of redoubt, a kind of refuge from the outside world. To me, I always thought, well, you're right. It is a kind of, taken to an extreme, it is a kind of extreme. It is a kind of unhealthy development. But it always seemed to me kind of like intuitively reasonable response to what was happening at the time, right? So the outside world did get kind of ugly, right? You're not living on farms anymore. People are living in these mass cities with they're dirty, and they're beset by these kind of new industrial forces, and the kind of sacred aspects of life seem to be kind of getting smaller and smaller, and it would make sense that people would then kind of turn their attention to they have this one thing, these intimate relations within the home. So I've always been kind of attracted to the idea of the family as this kind of critical node within the kind of larger field of social relations, a kind of something that akin to a kind of aesthetic culture, aesthetic culture of opposition. But, and so there's a way in which I'm kind of attracted to this idea of opting out, of simply not participating, of not really drawing the circle around my family, even as I can't practically do it with my own family. But on the other hand, I agree, it's entirely impractical. I mean, you can say people can do it, but it's not. You can do it, but that's just a way of kind of bailing out. It's like quitting the public school system. There's still going to be a public school system that would be better if it were better rather than worse. And your, familial bailing out from it does not help that. And so the individualized, and I think that sometimes when I talk to conservative interlocutors, they're attracted to this idea, this kind of Benedict, I don't remember the Benedict option kind of idea of simply departing from society. Well, I'm not really interested in that. I feel like that doesn't help any. I mean, that helps a very small number of people. That's assuming you can make it work, because I feel like people can make it work, because homeschooling actually can be it ends up being a good competitive strategy for a certain tier of people, right? So there's a way in which you're virtuously opting out in order to compete better. So it's, in a way, it's kind of taints the whole retreat. But I feel like this is the point in the book where I simply kind of throw up my hands and say, well, it would be better if we had a better society. It would be better if we had a society where the need to compete is weaker, where you don't feel like the stakes of failure are so great, and that is, that's the kind of reformist model that I kind of ultimately arrive at. I kind of talk myself into, after a long time of flirting with various types of kind of classical liberalism over my kind of intellectual life, I've, somehow talked myself into being kind of a soft social democrat when it comes to this stuff, that the solutions that you refer to are not really individual solutions, kind of a hyper atomizing of individual families, but rather you achieve the good aspects of kind of family privacy and intimacy better when families don't feel like they have to compete so hard in the outside world. That the autonomy of family life is maybe served by a little bit by a less atomized society. So this is where the in a way, given my kind of intellectual background, I find myself in my deviations from my original influences. I kind of find myself constantly arguing with conservatives and libertarians about this stuff, where the freedom that they vaunt, the freedom that they kind of identify with American civil society, is less free than they think it is, and that perhaps there are freedom maximizing or freedom enhancing public policies that we would do that would in fact be not liberal or libertarian, but more like social democratic, and that the family autonomy of the family would be better served if in a society in which we did not feel like we had to compete so hard.
Well, Matt, this has been great. Little Platoons, Defense, Family, in a Competitive Age. Check it out. I hope to hear more from you. Hope you can elaborate on these themes and expand on them. So look forward to that. Great chatting with you. Hopefully we can chat in person sometime soon.
This is Unsilo, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.